Hello, folks. I wanted to give you an update on the Paycheck Protection Program as we had disseminated as much information in quick bites that were easy to consume regarding this program, and especially the applicability to nonprofits, whether you're a nonprofit EMS organization or a religious institution, or maybe you were a 1099 employee, you were self-employed. You also qualified for this Paycheck Protection Program. I've asked Scott Moore with Scott Moore and Consultants. He's an attorney, personal friend of mine, to actually break this down, this 11-page application that was just released. You will see in this Facebook Live, or if you're watching it via Instagram or Twitter, I've also included the URL that if you click on that, it'll take you directly to this 11-page forgiveness loan document, because you may or may not have heard this from your lender quite yet. But if you prepare yourself ahead of time as your loan becomes due, and how do you go about the forgiveness process, I'm trying to get this information out to you so you can kind of walk through the process. So Scott's going to take this over, kind of walk through, and at the end, I'm going to wrap up with some points that you need to consider, as well as some things that are going on in DC to help address some of the issues that have arisen through this Paycheck Protection Program. So Scott?
Thank you, Asbel. As many of you know, the PPP loan program was created by Congress in an effort to stave off an anticipated huge job loss as a result of either business closure or business downturn because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, through that program, employers were permitted to borrow up to 8.5 weeks worth of their payroll so that they can continue to pay employees through the 8-week period. So what we've been waiting for, though, and we haven't seen yet until late last week, was what the loan forgiveness process was going to look like. So last week, the SBA published their 11-page PPP loan forgiveness application. The application consists really of 4 different sections, one being the loan forgiveness calculation form, the PPP Schedule A, which is where you detail out many of those cash payroll, non-cash payroll, and non-payroll business expenses that were used as the basis for your loan. Also, there is the PPP Schedule A worksheet, which is where you work through the calculating out the payroll and the head count, not only from the covered period, which is that 8-week period following the funding of the loan, but from the measurement period, which was that period upon which you used as an 8-week period to measure payroll before the COVID pandemic impacts hit your business. So the last section on the form is an owner demographic, and it's an optional form where the borrower can identify whether they're a veteran-owned business, whether they are a male or female-owned business, or in particular a particular nationality. That form, of course, is optional. So what you are going to need to submit to the lender, though, for the purposes of completing your application, will be that PPP loan forgiveness calculation form, which is page 3, and then the PPP Schedule A, which is where you detail out all of those payroll, cash payroll, non-cash payroll, and then other permitted business expenses. So what will you need in order to complete this loan application packet? Well, you're going to likely need most of the information that you used when you originally filed for and completed your PPP loan application. So if you still have that available, you should pull that out. You're likely also going to want the promissory note that you received from the SBA lender on there, because in filling out this form, you're going to need their SBA lender number. You're going to need the SBA loan number. In addition, you're going to need the documentation that you will use as the basis for which you support whether you have continued, whether you use those expenses. So PPP loan borrowers are able to potentially seek forgiveness for the entire amount of their loan, provided they used at least 75% of the proceeds of the loan for payroll-related expenses. So you are going to need, what the government wants to know is, you need to show us that in fact you continued to pay those employees during that 8-week period. So you'll need either your Form 941 tax statements, or many of the payroll providers have created custom reports for this exact purpose. So if you work with a payroll provider, contact that payroll provider so that you can ask them if they've created this report. If they haven't, chances are you won't be the only one of their customers who's seeking this kind of information. I bet you they'll create it. But in most instances, the big ones have already created such a report. You're also going to need to submit with your application the documentation for those non-cash payroll costs. So health benefits, contributions to retirement plans. Now, one of the things that business owners should know is that the contributions for their health benefits as owners or their retirement benefits as owners are not permitted to be part of that calculation. I guess ownership has its privileges. And then you are going to need the documentation for those non-payroll costs. So you're permitted to use 25% for those non-payroll related costs. So mortgage interest, business rent, so business mortgage interest, business rent, utilities, etc. So now as you are going to work through those forms, one of the critical forms on there is that Schedule A worksheet. That is where you're going to go through and analyze your payroll from the measurement period, which is that 8-week period that you used to fill out your application. So where you were determining how much money do I need, or how much would I need to cover payroll for 8 weeks. So the SBA is permitting the borrower to use one of two covered periods. The covered period, as the standard covered period, is that 8-week period that starts on the day the loan was funded through 8 weeks. But because the SBA recognizes that many of the businesses have payroll periods that may start a few days after the loan was funded, they're permitting borrowers to make an election and decide, I'm going to use what's called the alternative covered payroll period. Now, it's important for people completing the application to know, for the purposes of measuring how you spent that money during the covered period or alternative covered period, the alternative covered period is only for payroll related expenses, because they recognize your payroll period may start. You may have been funded halfway through a payroll period. So to make it easy for you, they're permitting you to start that 8-week measurement covered period from the first day of the pay period following the funding of the loan. That, of course, is really up to you as borrower. So the other thing that you're going to need to do, it's not just about making sure that you didn't reduce wages, it's also to make sure that you didn't reduce headcount. So here, the SBA is permitting you to use two options, whichever one is more beneficial for you as well. So one is that FTE calculation, which is you take the 8-week period, you add up the total number of hours, you divide those total number of hours by 8, and then divide it by 40. So, an example, 320 hours during the covered period, that 8-week period. I divide that by 8, that equals 40. If I divide 40 by 40, that of course equals 1. That is one full-time equivalent employee. The alternative method is, if you have an employee and you only need to count for the purposes of this alternative method, you only need to count up to 40 hours. So if you have an employee who did 60 hours, once you hit 40, that counts as 1. If you have an employee who worked less than 40 hours, so they worked 20 hours or 30 hours, that would equal 0.5. So you can see how, depending upon how the calculation plays out and how many hours we're talking about, how that one method may benefit you as compared to the other method. So it's important though, and there are multiple spots throughout this 11-page application where they have the various worksheets that help you work through the process. Now, at the bottom of that Schedule A worksheet, there is an area for some of the safe harbors. So if in fact you did have a reduction in wages, because let's say, for example, you had employees that by the time your loan was funded, they had been on unemployment and were receiving that additional stipend or $600 payment that was provided as a result of those folks who were on unemployment during this COVID pandemic. Made it really difficult for a lot of employees to make that decision to actually lose money to come back to work. Well, one of the safe harbors provides that if you did make a written offer to that employee to return, but they chose not to return, you won't be penalized as a result of that, bona fide written offer to that employee. You won't be penalized because you didn't pay those wages because they failed to return. So it's just important. This is a relatively, if you are a one-person business or a very small business, this form is not going to be challenging for you at all. However, if you do have a fair number of employees, it's really important that you engage your financial and legal professionals. So, plenty of resources that are available out there. Many times the lender at your bank will be able to provide you with some assistance, but my advice is to either reach out to an attorney who's familiar with this process or to an accountant who's familiar with this process. Many of the accounting firms were very dialed in on exactly what was required here because, of course, when it comes to doing business taxes, when you receive potentially essentially a tax-free grant, if in fact the loan gets forgiven, that's going to have impacts as you do your financials. So don't go it alone. Reach out for assistance and take a look at the SBA website. And if you need assistance, I'm sure folks like myself or Asbel and his team can certainly help you as well. So with that, back to you, Asbel. Thank you.
So thank you, Scott. Hopefully, folks, that was some information to simplify this, to not make it so or seem so burdensome to you. But hopefully get with your tax accountant if you have one. If not, and you're doing this on your own, as I know many of you probably are, go through the process and break this down. It is not as intimidating as it might appear. So reach out for help. But let me go over just a few other things for you to consider, and that is the documentation requirements. So there is going to be documents that you're going to have to submit with this forgiveness loan. The one thing that I want to draw to your attention is if you have bank accounts, you might need to submit copies of canceled checks if you don't have that. If you're a larger employee, even though you're a small business and maybe you have 20 employees or 50 employees, you might be filing like a Form 941 with your tax filings or what have you. That is going to be sufficient documentation for you to submit as well. Payments, receipts, canceled checks, for you that might be a single 1099. You own your own business, maybe just 1 or 2 employees. You might be a church with 3 to 5 or 6 or 7 staff members as well as you're walking through this. Remember, because 75% of it is related to your payroll, you can use the other 25% on rents and different things like that. Make sure you have that appropriate documentation that you're going to have to submit. Also, for many of you that are not used to doing small business loans or what have you, there is some documentation that you're going to be required to keep on file for a minimum of 6 years. That is for when if any of the small business representatives want to come in and check to validate the information that you applied to for the forgiveness, or the Office of Inspector General. And so all of the information regarding the individuals, as Scott mentioned earlier, that you're going to have to list out the employees that you might have, especially for the small businesses that might have numerous employees. That specific paperwork related to that, if you had to furlough someone and then they came back and they decided to not come back, all that documentation, you're not going to be required to submit it for the forgiveness. You're just signing an attestation. But that individual paperwork you will want to keep on file. And the requirement is for at least 6 years. Okay. Now, there are some issues relative to the small business loan that the Congress is going to try to address. One is related to, before you got the Paycheck Protection Program loan, you might have had to lay off people. This is very common in the retail space or any other space where you might have had to lay off people and then you brought them back. However, with the social distancing, the opening up there, some of the retail stores were closed. And so the framework of the loan forgiveness program is in a specified date, as Scott mentioned earlier. So I know Congress is looking to address that issue to allow for you to use an 8-week period of when you actually went back into business or you hired the staff back or what have you. So I know we were discussing with several senators last week and this week about that, and there is ongoing dialogue happening, and it's actually on a bipartisan basis, so that's very good to address some of those concerns as well. So stay tuned to the Small Business Administration website. Stay tuned to what is happening in D.C. relative to the good that's coming out of this, and some of those nuances that need to be fixed as well. Hopefully, folks, this tutorial was beneficial to you. I just wanted to get information out there because I do know that many that I was hearing from did not understand that this application had gone out. I want to thank my good friend Brandon Payne, who has a fantastic firm in Mississippi, for alerting me to this as well, that this forgiveness loan application was out there. If you have any questions, most of you know how to get a hold of me. If not, we'll try to provide information as we get it. But hopefully this was useful, and I hope you have a great day.